Good afternoon and welcome everyone. We're happy to have so many folks joining for today's webinar. My name is Erin Bremer. I'm a graduate assistant for the Zare Institute, and I will be starting us off by going over our agenda for the next hour and a half before I hand things over to our host for today, Dr. Kathy Evans, talking about expanding the circle, restorative justice in education for diverse learners. Kathy will first give an introduction for each of our guest speakers, who will share a little bit about themselves and dive into our topic for today. We want to note that all of our speakers will do their very best to communicate so that you viewers can follow along, but please comment in whatever comment section of the platform that you're using if you have any difficulty with the speed of their conversation or understanding. Following their presentation, there will be time for questions and answers from questions from you all, moderated by our host. And then once the Q&A portion has concluded, I'll hop back on to share a few announcements related to our next webinar and the Zare Institute. There will be a recording of this webinar posted on the Zare Institute's website and YouTube channel by the end of this week if you would like to return to it or share it with others. Thank you so much and enjoy. Now I'll hand it over to Kathy.
Hi, everybody. Welcome today. I'm excited about our session, and I want to just take a moment and introduce our guests. First is Jessica Gonzalez, who joined an organization called School Talk, working with a part of School Talk called Inclusive DC, which supports youth with disabilities across the DC area. We are excited about Jessica bringing her knowledge about disability and restorative justice into our conversation today. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kathy. And very happy to be here. We'll go a little bit deeper into our bios, but just super happy to be here and just share our experience and knowledge with this topic, which is very near and dear to me. So welcome, everyone. Hello. And I prefer Jess. So yes, okay. Jess or Jessica is fine, but preference Jess.
Jess. Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also want to introduce Chelsea Kovacs. Chelsea also has been working with School Talk in DC. She's the program manager for the college and career readiness work. She also works across the DC area to also provide support for disability students with disabilities, and looking forward to hearing from Chelsea as well. And again, much more in-depth bio in a moment. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you, Kathy.
And then unable to join us today is Lisa Shaw, who works with Restorative DC as the Special Projects Manager, also having lots of experience with education and working with people with disabilities, experiential education, environmental stewardship. And I believe the three of you work together pretty extensively, and so I'm sure that Lisa's voice will be part of our conversation, whether she's physically present or not. So welcome, Lisa. So I'm excited to begin. I think we want to just begin with a little bit more in-depth bio. So I'll invite Jess to just share a little bit more about your work with Restorative DC, with School Talk, with Inclusive DC, and what brings you to this conversation today.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Kathy. So I have 10 plus years of education, especially working in the space of special education as a bilingual special education teacher, then a special education coordinator, and then my path led me to School Talk, where both restorative justice practices and working with students with complex needs came together, and I've been now working with our School Talk nonprofit just across the city, providing staff professional development, working with our students in their secondary transition planning, providing services and resources for at the student level, the school level, but also working with local agencies to improve the services that they provide, and how we can just be partners in all of this to help our students thrive in the city. Thank you.
Chelsea, can you tell us a little bit more about your work as well? And then I got some questions. I want to pull this together, so I'm excited. Chelsea.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet you. I'm Chelsea Kovacs. First, I just wanted to give a little plug about what School Talk is. Both Jess and I work at School Talk. We're a small but mighty nonprofit located in the District of Columbia. And we really envision school communities where all students feel honored and self-determined. And kind of our path or way of getting there is to tackle complex problems that impact marginalized youth, as long as the schools and the systems that support them. School Talk was founded in 2008. And our kind of special sauce is really looking at the intersection of special education and restorative justice. I myself a special education or a seasoned special education teacher, and I focused in the area of workforce development. I worked with students who are getting ready to transition from high school to post-school life. Yeah, and so that's a little bit about me, and really excited to be here today.
Super. Well, thank you for being here. I look forward to digging in. I'm a special ed teacher by background, and then here at Eastern Mennonite University, I work in the restorative justice and education, and so I'm teaching a class right now on inclusive school communities and how do we nurture those. So I sit at the intersections also of this restorative justice and disability. So I'm looking forward to our conversation, but I'm also first looking forward to your presentation. So I'm going to be quiet and let us hear from y'all for a minute, and then we'll jump into some dialogue. So thank you.
Awesome. And we can go ahead and skip ahead to slide 5 since we already did some of our introductions. Awesome. So just wanted to start us off today. We want to first start off by briefly defining how we at School Talk define restorative justice in the educational context, just to access your prior knowledge and to really just ground us in restorative justice. We also want to start to expand our understanding of diverse learners across the U.S. And then we're going to discuss the intersection of restorative justice and multilingual special education, as well as identify some practical applications of restorative justice among diverse learners. And go ahead. And the way that we're going to do that today, we'll start off just, we have our presentation broken down into 3 areas. Again, that overview of restorative justice, looking at that intersection of restorative justice and multilingual special ed, and then talking through some practical applications and strategies. All right, so just wanted to set the context. This is how we at School Talk define restorative justice. We can go ahead to the next slide. So for us, restorative justice, it's really a philosophy and a set of supporting practices that center around community, around equitable and inclusive relationships of trust, understanding, and collaboration. It has roots in indigenous approaches to living in relationship with each other, including traditions of storytelling and circle, and reintegration of those who have harmed others. We here really value the 3 pillars of restorative justice, really recognizing harms and needs, the harm that impacts our members of our communities, and the needs of both individuals who have been impacted by harm and who have harmed, because our practices are really trauma informed. We also do focus on accountability and obligations, as well as engagement and resiliency. Since we define restorative justice really as a philosophy, to really employ that philosophy, it really requires that paradigm shift. So core to our restorative justice framework is the belief of a proactive approach that helps teachers and staffs in the school recognize student trauma, create spaces to express themselves emotionally, and also establish restorative policies, procedures to promote trust, compassion, inclusivity, accountability, safety, equity, collaboration, and growth. We find it very important to kind of compare our traditional retributive mindsets to our restorative mindset. So really kind of making that switch from where we make those assumptions that our strongest human drive is fear, but really, sorry about that. Whew, getting a little nervous. Kind of moving from the assumption of our human drive being fear to the assumption that our human drives really being based around compassion and being in relationships. We want to move from the assumption that humans are independent and understanding them in isolation to really moving to understanding humans as interdependent beings that must be understood within the context of a community. We also want moving from those assumptions that offenses are defined as individual violations or breaking of rules to really looking at them as acts of harm that are arriving from how we're interacting within a community. And we're also want to take that assumption of looking at accountability through authority kind of imposing guilt on individuals and punishment to accountability being more of an internal process of understanding and repairing harm. God, you could switch up to the next. So here at School Talk, we really, when we're talking about restorative practices in schools, we really focus on our investment and our return. So if we're really investing in our proactive practices, such as community building, developing empathy, fostering wellness, promoting equity, we're going to reduce those incidents of negative behavior. And even if an incident of negative behavior if we are responding rather than reacting, so responding by addressing those challenging behaviors, by resolving conflict, by teaching students, we're going to reduce those behaviors and we're going to reduce the time out of class. So that return on that investment is really going to be fewer suspensions and expulsions, fewer absences, more time in class means more time spent learning, which means improved academic outcomes. Go ahead to the next one. Also here, we do recognize that our restorative practices occur on a continuum, anywhere from our kind of informal ways that we look at how we identify as individuals and the mindsets that we use, all the way through to the skills that we use to address conflict. So our specific practices, they include active listening, creating safe spaces, peer mediation, restorative communication, and restorative circles. And then we do focus on our two types of restorative circles. So our proactive circles that we're spending most of our 80% of our time on, creating that positive school culture and and preventing our minor or serious incidences. And then we also talk through our restorative circles, which are typically after an incident and how we're, again, responding, not reacting to incidences to repair harm and prevent it from reoccurring. So we want to take a moment and talk through why is restorative justice important for our diverse learners. So first, we wanted to define who our diverse learners are. So one across the United States, we do usually do presentations like this in DC. But across the United States, our diverse learners, or our students with disabilities, represent 1 in 7 students. And it's important to recognize that of those 1 in 7 students, 95% of them are in our general education classroom, in our general education schools, and nearly 70% of them are spending the majority of the day in our general education classrooms. And what that's really telling us is that our students with disabilities, we may not even realize that a student has a disability in our classroom. They may be visible, they may be invisible, and we just want to recognize that regardless of whether or not a student has a disability, we want to make sure that we are ensuring that all of our students have access to restorative practices. We also wanted to highlight that about 1 in 10 students across the US identify as an English language learner. And about 16% of those English language learners, so maybe like 1 in 63 students, have a dual diagnosis or also have a documented disability. When we're talking about our students with diverse learners, it's important to highlight that racial and economic disproportionality exists, and that has a big impact, and we'll get to that into the next slide. We pulled this book from a book. It's called Discrit. It's a book that really looks at critical race theory and Disability Studies. And it highlights that a disproportionate number of non-dominant racial, ethnic, and linguistic students continue to be referred or labeled and placed in special education, particularly in categories of learning disability, intellectual disability, which was formerly known as mental retardation, emotional disturbance, or behavioral disorders. These categories are often referred to as what's called high incidence categories. And they can be problematic in terms of diagnosis because they rely on subjective judgment and of school personnel rather than biological facts. When we really kind of understand and look at the disproportionality amongst our special education population, it helps us starts to explore the harm that exists within our special education system. Go ahead, there we go. So what do we know about our diverse learners? We know that students with disabilities are expelled and suspended at higher rates than their non-disabled peers. And disparities worsen when we're looking at the data when it's disaggregated by race. For example, according to the United States Department of Education Civil Rights data collection in the 2017-2018 school year, students with disabilities only represented about 13% of the total student enrollment. However, they were receiving 23% of expulsions, out of school expulsions, with educational services, and about 15% of expulsions without educational services. Furthermore, they represented about 20% of students receiving one or more in-school suspensions and 25% of students receiving out-of-school expulsions. So the rate at which, or the prevalence of students with disabilities in our general population is more represented in our population of students that are experiencing seclusion. When we look at disparities, they worsen when we're disaggregating the data by race. For example, Black students served under IDEA accounted for only about 2.5% of the total enrollment. However, they received 6.2%, so about 3 times as many of the one or more in-school suspensions, and about 8 or almost 9%, so nearly 4 times as many of the outer school suspensions. We also know that students with disabilities experience lower post-secondary education and employment rate. So in 2021, the American Community Survey showed that the employment rate amongst individuals with disabilities was about 41% as compared to the employment rate of individuals without disabilities, which is about 79%. So that gap is looking at about a 38% percentage point difference. Likewise, when we're looking at achievement of a high school diploma, there's about a 9% percentage gap. And as we're attaining higher levels of education, that gap increases. Go ahead. All right. So how can restorative justice help? Restorative justice, it helps us develop social and emotional skills amongst all youth, both our youth with and without disabilities. It helps us develop self-determination skills, self-awareness, self-advocacy, self-management skills, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. It also helps build a positive culture on multiple levels. It helps build those peer-to-peer relationships, relationships within a classroom, and relationships among the whole school. Restorative justice really helps us improve those seclusion rates to keep our kids in school so that they can access the services that they need to improve their post-school outcomes. I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to go ahead and pass my microphone over to my colleague Jessica to start talking about how we can maximize our restorative practices for diverse learners.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you for giving us that background. Again, and I welcome folks to add comments in the chat, any questions as we work through our presentation. So, how to maximize restorative practices for diverse learners. Next. Schools use proactive circles to establish positive school culture by creating space for students, staff, and families to share and learn from each other. Proactive circles promote social-emotional learning through structured opportunities for self-exploration, self-expression, intentional listening, and engaging with the school community. So circles can be used at different levels with different folks, all in the pursuit of getting to engage with each other and build positive school community and culture. Next. So why circles? Circles represent equity and equality, safety and trust, shared responsibility and ownership, participatory facilitator, and builds connection. So looking at the circle there on the side, the image, restorative justice in schools, 3 components. So again, build and maintain healthy relationships, create equitable learning spaces, and repair harm and transform conflict. Our proactive circle design process. So we begin the process. Um, the proactive circle design process is an iterative, continuous improvement cycle. First, the circle keeper identifies the best circle format to use. Then they assess the participants' needs and design the circle flow with appropriate modifications. Circle keepers then prepare the space and materials and facilitate the circle itself. Afterwards, the circle keeper must reflect on the successes and challenges of the circle, and within itself, it continues. It's a cycle, and it builds on each other. Next, identify circle types. Now we're getting into the different types of circles, different types of restorative circles. Commonly, we can start with a community building circle. We have curriculum and teaching learning circle, hot topic, difficult conversation circle, social emotional learning circle, a staff circle, youth led and peer to peer circle, family and community circle. So, circles are tools that can be used for many proactive approaches. Community building circles help you to get to know your students and fellow staff members and build deeper personal connections and relationships. Curriculum or teaching and learning circles allow you to approach a new topic to build background and knowledge and are a great way to start a lesson. Hot topic or difficult conversation circles allow you to explore topics that otherwise may have been avoided until harm has been caused. Social emotional learning circles allow you to pre teach important social emotional skills such as self awareness, self management, responsible decision making, responsible relationship, and social awareness. SEL skills are tools students can use to learn and prevent and or approach conflict. If you are not sure where to start with a circle, we suggest you begin with a community building circle to help assess participants' needs. Um, and many of these I have personally used in my experience as a teacher, especially in my last setting. That was part of our school culture. We started with a hot topic circle. Sometimes it was a social emotional. It all built up or depended on where we left off the day before or how we wanted to start off our day. So it's really assessing the needs. But here are a few of the type of circles you can hold in your spaces. Next, we have assess participant needs. So here we have, for example, because we're coming out of it, but you will review any relevant COVID-19 policies. With circles, we understand that you're coming into close space with each other. Some people may not feel comfortable, but just really understanding what are the policies and where people are in terms of comfort level in being together. If it's in person, circles can also happen virtually. Next, we have analyze school climate data. That there will inform so much of what is going on, what are some trends that we can look at, and inform what type of circles we'll need to be able to address the challenges we may be seeing, uncovering from the data, or just taking a proactive approach to helping minimizing the numbers of incidents that are happening in a school, for example. Next, you can scan for common social emotional challenges. And next we have examine students' individualized education plans or other records to inform some of those needs. Circle keepers should assess participants' needs prior to designing proactive circles. This definitely requires a lot of forehand just data gathering and really knowing who's going to be part of this space. Assessments will provide circle keepers the knowledge they need to select and implement appropriate modifications. Assessments may also include reviewing relevant policies that are going on in the school, analyzing school climate data, and scanning for common social emotional challenges, and examining students' individualized education plans and their other records. As part of the assessment process, facilitators can engage participants in a community building circle to learn more about them. And circle keepers' understanding of participants' needs will deepen over time as trusting relationships develop. So again, this is a process that builds upon itself. So what you put in will inform the next pieces. Next, we have our design and flow modifications. So after assessing participants' needs, circle keepers should design the circle with appropriate modifications to engage all participants to mitigate potential barriers. This is very important. Again, a circle does require a lot of prep work, and that process of designing your flow will help also guide and navigate the conversations we're about to go into, and also just be mindful of what modifications are needed so our diverse learners can participate. If there is a language barrier, if there is a processing barrier there, like how can we help? How can our design help access this our students access the information we're going to share and just also be part of the conversation? Next, we have modifications for safer, more inclusive, proactive circles. So going into it, present information in different ways. So we understand with our diverse learners, one way does not fit all. This is a space to be creative. This is a time to really dive deep and look in ways that you can present this information so our students can access, or our participants can access this information based on whatever their background is. Next, you have tap into individual interests and preferences to motivate participation. Sitting in a circle and looking at each other is a very vulnerable space to be in. So what ways can you pull in interests and preferences to really get those folks or individuals that we know that tend to sit back or not participate? What can get them to break out of that shell and start to feel part of the circle and also build trust? Encourage participants to express themselves in ways that work for them. We can only find that out through talking to each other. This is something that can be done in the process of developing that flow. Talk to them and see what it is that motivates them, what they're interested in, so you can embed that in your flow. So schools should use proactive circles, keeping to hear directly from students, to build trust and foster feeling of safety and belonging that all students need to learn and thrive both social, emotionally, and academically. Including modifications in the ways that the circle keeper represents information and the ways that the participants can express themselves creates a safer and more inclusive circle experience for all participants. So always keep your participants in mind. This means presenting information in different ways, including in writing, verbally, visually, physically, tapping into individuals' interests and preferences to motivate participation and encourage participation to express themselves in whatever ways work best for them. Seasoned special education staff and staff relate these concepts to a universal design for learning. So UDL. Really keep that in mind. Your universal design for learning. What is the best approach for all of our diverse learners and what they need and our participants so they can best access information that's being shared in these spaces. Next. So here we have more lists, a longer list of examples of modifications. You can provide circle materials in advance, including question prompts. This way, students or participants in a circle know what questions are going to be asked. They can also ask for clarification beforehand so they're comfortable answering and have a better understanding. Allow participants to observe a circle and share reflections or ask questions afterwards. A way that you can do that is even through a fishbowl style where there's an inner circle and then an outer circle. So students who are not comfortable yet can sit in that outer circle and observe and then eventually jump in. When they're comfortable, that's a way to ease into that process or offer opportunity to observe. You can allow participants opting out of the full circle to participate in a small group or pair activity during the circle. You can provide opportunity for participants to co-facilitate the circle. This is also building up others in our community to also lead in this practice and teaching our students how to do this as well for themselves, just to just build those skills so they can have in their toolkits. Ask hesitant participants to support the circle keeper with setup and breakdown. You can invite participants to become an agreement keeper, a role that helps bring the circle back to establish agreements. Offer reluctant participants the opportunity to lead a state changer during a circle, such as a mindful moment, the energizer piece of it, or a movement break. If appropriate, ask a participant if a peer can support them or speak on their behalf if they're shy or don't want to, or that they feel comfortable. Allow participants to write down or draw their responses and place them in the center of the circle. Envision additional alternate means of participation and be creative. This truly is a space to then take what you've learned from your participants, their needs, and then be able to present it in creative ways that will increase participation. You're welcome, Jennifer. I saw your comment there. Yes, UDL. Next, we have prepared materials and space. So here we go a little deeper. Now that we've gathered, we've done our assessments, we've gathered the information we need. Now let's prepare the materials and the space. So keeping in mind our seating arrangements, our centerpiece, our talking pieces, you can have more than one, our opening ceremony, our values that we're going to review, guidelines, opening round, primary circle content, our closing round, and the closing ceremony. So circle keepers should prepare all materials for the service in the circle in advance, including readings, talking pieces, centerpieces, visuals, instructions, and more. These materials should reflect any modification identified in the assess and design phase. Circle keepers should also prepare the physical or virtual space where the circle will occur. In physical spaces, this includes appropriate seating arrangement and audiovisual technology. In virtual environments, this means setting up the meeting platform and preparing all virtual elements. Circle keepers may need to make modifications to physical or virtual spaces to adhere to policies or guidelines and meet the needs of the participants. And also keep in mind that the various aspects of the circles you are preparing for. So it's a lot of preparation, but it will ensure a smooth process and experience. And it is a practice that, again, builds on itself. Next. All right. Facilitate circles with participants. You can employ restorative mindsets and remain present. You can use affective statements and restorative questions. So using I statements to tell the listener how the person feels and why it makes them feel that way. Lean into previously developed group values and guidelines. Leave space for students to take ownership. All right, so here we have reflect on success and challenges. Each circle is a learning opportunity. Embrace and approach failures with curiosity. Gather data from participants to inform future circles. So it is very important to reflect after a circle process because, again, like I've said before, it builds on each other. It informs the next steps. It informs how what we should do, how we should approach, what needs to change, or what's working, and continue that. Next, we have embrace the process. Embrace the process. A circle never ends. It is an ongoing tool to sustain change. I truly, truly just want to push that and just really push folks to embrace this process. It may not always seem so easy or straightforward. It does take work, but it does take practice, and the practice itself will once you start owning it, it gets easier, it gets better. And students, for me, the biggest win is seeing students do it on their own. When there's not an adult facilitating, when there's no adult telling them what to do. And I've witnessed students at the lunch table coming together and saying, you know what, we have to stop. Let's sit down. Let's talk about this. Let's get in a circle. And they've put themselves in a circle and talked it out. And just seeing that was amazing. Seeing students just truly own that. Next, we have our Learn More. Here we have some resources. We have types of proactive circles. We have an article here. We have facilitating safer and more inclusive proactive circles. You can check this out. You can take a screenshot there, use your phone, and open up the QR code there, and it'll take you straight to our Restorative DC resources, where you can find more resources on how to approach circle keeping and preparing for our students and our staff members as well. Next. And here you have our contact information. You feel free to take it down, reach out to us if you have any questions. And we have our references here as well, information that we've used throughout our presentation. I would like to take it over now to questions and answers, Q&A part of our presentation.
Thank you all so much. What's really good information in there. And I was excited to see the link between restorative circles and UDL. And thanks for bringing that into the space. And I know that there were some comments there about UDL. There's also some questions there that I want to bring up first, and then we can engage in some conversation as well. There's one question here. I'm the parent of a diverse learner in Chicago. My kindergartner has 27 kids in her class, and her teacher is wiped out and fairly curmudgeonly. I'm having a really hard time imagining him buying into circles in general, let alone one that requires this amount of prep. Any suggestions for getting buy-in from burned out teachers?
Definitely. We hear you loud and clear. It is something we are working with so many teachers across our city here. It is a reality, and a way that you can just start the practice or get into it. A good way is just implementing it in the morning. Usually kids are a little more calmer, some, not all, but just starting those morning circles of community building, where you just hear each other. That would be my suggestion, and just getting into the practice of it. Find somewhere in your day that where students you feel will be most engaged and can do this. You can start off in small circles, or you can start with the big one. But in the mornings, I've seen it in practice at the school that I previously worked at, and just to see how that impact had on the students and their day was very helpful. So That's a suggestion. Chelsea, if you have any others.
Yeah. And I see that it's also, we need to learn how to practice what we preach. So circles do not need to only happen amongst students, but happening in staff meetings to really get to the bottom of why are our teachers burnt out, which are obviously much more larger systemic issues, but what can be done with it within the staff community. So when staff are starting to practice some of those proactive approaches within their own staff meetings, then they're starting to have other staff members model for them what's works for them. They're really kind of having deeper conversations about what they really need as a staff to model some of these social emotional processes for their students. So also keeping in mind that a circle or these proactive approaches, they don't only happen in the classroom amongst teachers and students, they need to happen in other environments within the schools.
Earlier, I heard one of you talk about that you work at this intersection at 3 levels, at the student level, the school level, and the systems level. And so I would wonder, in this situation or in this question, are there systemic things that you can imagine happening that we could push for as well?
And at the systemic level, we do host our Restorative DC community of practice, which really takes a look at, it really pulls in stakeholders from school leadership, but also from other agencies that work and support schools that come together in circle and kind of discuss the different challenges that are happening within our community. In DC, some of the things that we're really experiencing is a very large increase of school violence, of gun violence. Our schools have become places where many students are not even showing up to, and if they are showing up to, they might come with a weapon and kind of leave it outside and then come into school and then come back. So we have created kind of at that systems level where we're pulling together the different stakeholders, the community stakeholders that are outside of the school together to being able to discuss these challenges that we're experiencing and how can we collaboratively problem solve or even just support each other in acknowledging that these are some harsh challenges that we're all experiencing. That was a good question. Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah, thanks. Does anybody else have any questions? Please feel free to add those into the comment section and we will address those. But I have written down a few questions myself. I hope that's okay. One of the things that I heard you talk about a little bit, and I was wondering if we could dig in a little bit more. When we talk about racial disparities in our school discipline practices, and we also talk about racial disparities even in our identification of students with disabilities due to implicit bias, the subjective nature of eligibility, etc. Can you just speak a little bit more to how you see those subjectivities kind of influencing how special ed happens and how restorative justice might address some of those concerns as well?
Yeah, and we see that particularly a lot amongst the students who are being labeled as emotional behavioral with emotional behavioral disabilities, where we staff are kind of getting burnt out with, hey, I don't really know how to manage behavior, so let me collect data on that behavior and put them in a more restrictive setting. And we know that the more restrictive setting that an individual is around age 9 kind of predicts the restrictive setting that they're going to be in as adults. So with our restorative practices, as we said, if we're taking those more proactive approaches in how do we address those, how do we not react to those behaviors, but how do we proactively prevent them, and then how do we respond to them appropriately? How do we address the harm that has been caused? How are we taking a look of what the behavior was and what needs, where's the learning? What social emotional skill does that student really need at this point that could be causing that behavior? What tools can we give that student to help them address conflict in the future so that the behavior doesn't result in harm? And if it does result in harm, so that they can work on becoming accountable for that harm, and then working on repairing that harm and repairing the relationships that the harm has created. And Jess, I think you were going to say something too. I didn't mean to cut you off, so I'll let you go ahead.
No, you summed it up well. That is that is the intent with this practice, is to also it's to really get down to the harm of it. It's always a root from something. And for our students that are, our marginalized students that experience a lot of the systemic harm from this, it's also teaching them how to respond. It's teaching them how to use their voice. It's teaching them how to tap into their self-awareness and then dig deep, provide them the skills that they need to become self-determined individuals, but also just have the language and tools to speak up and just let us know what is going on and how can we help you, because we can have all the solutions, but if someone is not ready to receive, then we're not going anywhere. So how do we create these safe spaces for all individuals involved to be able to have a voice, but also get to a solution and do it in a way where harm does not continue to occur?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Got a couple more questions. If we can move to another question here. I'm wondering if you could address some of the specific challenges for working in bilingual environments.
Mhm.
Like, do you allow children to speak in their native language during circles and then interpret what is said to the larger group? How do you build community when students don't speak the
Mhm.
same language or come from the same culture?
So I come from a bilingual. My first teaching experience was at a bilingual school, and as a bilingual learner myself, in those spaces, students are welcome to show up in however way they are comfortable. So part of that prep process is assessing your students and what their abilities are, what they're comfortable doing, and then seeking the modifications or supports that are needed. So if that student or person is comfortable having someone translate, then that's welcome in the circle. If a student wants to speak in their native language and is open to someone translating, that is welcome. So allowing participants to show up as they are, but part of it is also speaking to them beforehand. How would you like to participate? What supports do you prefer? What is who are you comfortable with assisting you with this? So it's providing agency for students and members to speak up for themselves and say, this is what I need, this is what works for me. um, and part of that is just hearing the person. Let me hear you. I don't care in what language you're speaking. Let me hear you, because in the delivery, the tone, you can pick up so much. Even if you don't understand what is going on, you can understand what a person is feeling just in the way they speak or are using their words. So that was a way that I would create that inclusive space for my bilingual learners, my newcomer students, who weren't completely new to all of this, completely new to this country, school system, everything. It can be very intimidating, but it part of the circle approach is to also build community. So you are part of this community. Teach us also how to help you.
And I hear in your response there, like just a real emphasis on the need for that pre-conferencing for circles. Like we have to have these conversations before we come to the circle to make sure that students are able to show up, or parents and caregivers or other educators can show up as their best self. And so knowing that ahead of time as circle keepers so that we prepare a circle that is indeed inclusive. Thank you for those responses.
And,
Chelsea.
and also using, hot topic circles where students can teach about their culture. Having a circle just about culture and going around and being able to share aspects of our identity, teaching, hey, I'm going to teach you simple phrases that I use, and not just a simple hi, hello, how are you, but here are some idioms that we use to really describe what's going on today. I taught with a lot of students in Samoa, where when a meeting was getting too long, we would have the saying "Uvel la fala," which means like the mat is getting hot. Like we've been sitting here too long. My rump is starting to hurt. I'm getting hungry. I'm ready to stop So in my class, I had my student being able to teach that phrase. And now students use that phrase where like, hey, we're starting to get into the conversation. Maybe this conversation's getting too much. No, this is the phrase that we're using to communicate that. And that started with just a hot topic conversation about culture, about different idioms that we use in our different cultures to just express, hey, this is too much for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Hey, so there's some more questions. They're popping in fast now. I am an elementary special ed teacher in Toronto. What is the biggest kind of pushback that you may have experienced from teachers or administrators? What are some of the biggest misconceptions about this work?
One of the misconceptions that I've seen a lot is restorative justice isn't discipline, or it's just soft. It allows individuals getting off the hook, where we kind of oversee that accountability part. When we're looking at, hey, harm has happened, we are still, holding somebody accountable, but we're going beyond that. We're going beyond to teaching what really happened and how are you using that to repair harm. And I know that Jess was going to come up with another. I didn't mean to cut you off, Jess. I'm sorry.
No. Thank you, Chelsea. Another one is you're expecting for everything to be solved, and that's a circle, and it's not. Part of our agreements, and that is accept non-closure. Sometimes we're not going to get to an answer, but we'll have a better understanding of what got us there. So that the piece of buy-in is part of the culture. You have to work it into the culture of the school. It is a practice. I'm very big on it. You can't preach about something you don't practice yourself. So can't talk about the benefits of a workout if you haven't done the workout. So in essence, it translates to it is tough. This is not an easy process. This is not everyone is on board. It takes time to build, but the benefits that I've seen from it and experienced from it have surpassed all those doubts when it comes to, is this really effective? It really taps into our listening skills. It really taps into our ability to understand, but to also seek to understand, going deeper, which is part of those prep processes, which is part of that reflective process, which is part of, well, maybe we don't need to do this in a big circle. We need a smaller one. So it is something that you have to like really just dive into and be okay that it is uncomfortable at times. It's going to be hard at times. But how do you build that resiliency to get through and use this process and move away from what we've traditionally used, which is, you know what, you made a mistake, get out of here. We don't want to exclude members from a community. We want to keep students. We want people to be part of the community. So how do we build that? And that's through, let's listen to each other. Let's work together.
Thanks, Shal. Here's another question. Do you know of any RJ practices being used with parents and caregivers of diverse learners, either for organizing parents and caregivers or within IEP meetings themselves?
Yeah. We've actually encouraged using the circle process to supporting students in facilitating their own IEP meetings. So really working with a student in them kind of preparing their own circle on how they can describe their, needs, how they can support others in the circle and describing what their needs are in the circle and how they can support the student. So we've really encouraged using a circle process in the IEP meeting. We know that IEP meetings tend to be not a safe space for parents and students. It tends to be this litigious space. But starting it in circle or using that process makes that more of a team space, makes it more of a community space around a student. We've also seen using, the circle process after a litigious IEP meeting to kind of reflect off of that meeting to see how it went, to see what were the challenges that what did that experience look like for the parent, for the student, for the gen ed teacher, for the SPED teacher, for the administrator who was, or the principal designee who was present, or any of the related service providers. Was everybody's voice really heard? And Jess, I think I saw you raise your hand to also.
Yeah, no, I think it's also bringing in families, because again, this is a practice that may just be happening at the school, and it's new for folks at home. So how do you bring them in? How do you incorporate them in that process? So part of that is sharing things ahead of time so they're prepared, having, a pre-conference to the conference. So like, let's check in and prepare each other for the information we're about to receive in this session. And like Chelsea said, I have sat in many IEP meetings where I felt very tense, and I'm like, but we're all here serving the student. Why is this feeling like that? It's just it helps in understanding the work that each of us is doing and providing for the student, but it's also helping build this, allowing the student to really know, like, this is my team. These are the people that are helping me. Um, and also building up their voice and helping them, be part of that process and not just be a receiver, but a contributor. Um, I've seen the benefit of that. Even in meetings like, when harm was done, a student, had an infraction. We have to bring in both parties and, facilitating those type of meetings with a circle. It's helpful. And it also just shows families like these are the practices that we have. And these are tools you can take home and also do at home. That's also very helpful in opening up, the dialogue and continuing the dialogue.
Thanks. I heard about a school that was doing circles for all IEP meetings. And there's a question here, and I'm really curious from your perspective. In that school, it was the special ed teacher who was facilitating the circles for the IEP meetings. But this question here says, who in the school should facilitate conferences? And just thinking about power differentials and who has power and how are they using that power in the facilitation of those circles. Wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
I think it depends on, when you're after you've assessed your participant needs and you're really kind of identifying, why you're having that circle, what the purpose of the circle is. For a circle that there has been harm, you would really want to make sure you're not doing any further harm. So you do want to make sure that the person that is facilitating the circle is somebody who is well versed in restorative justice and really does, know how to approach the problem in a way that is not going to further the harm. If you are doing kind of a more proactive circle, then you're thinking, okay, it could be a student, it could be a teacher, it could be self-led, where we're having more prompts that kind of the responsibility for facilitating the circle is shared amongst all of the members. So you really do want to, when you're making that decision of who's going to be leading the circle, those are some of the thoughts that you're keeping in mind in terms of like paradigm, in terms of who, if it is I'm stumbling over my words. So long story short, it depends. It depends on the type of circle that you're doing, and you do want to kind of keep those in mind. And Jess was going to also pull in.
No, I definitely want to support that. Being mindful of who's part of the circle and not perpetuating the harm any further. So that's part of the assessment of needs and who's going to participate. So in part, it can be anyone, but keeping in mind the roles that folks have can determine that. So like I shared before, a student can facilitate, a teacher, the coordinator. And so it's just identifying who is best for that particular circle.
I've heard y'all talk about like self-determination, and I know there's a whole program called I Am Determined where students do kind of lead their own IEP practice. Is that one way to address sometimes the power differentials that can happen between a special ed teacher who might be seen in a particular way and a student having less power and maybe kind of shifting that, providing a little bit more of a centering of student voice there?
My most successful IEP meetings have been the ones where I've worked ahead of time with my students and the student has facilitated. I think the best feedback I've ever gotten from a student is after he he kind of, we use a circle process to help prepare him to run his own meeting. And he goes, wow, that's the first time I left that meeting without hating myself. Because he has been so used to people just talking about his deficits, mom getting upset and kind of feeling on the defense. And it switched the entire dynamic of the entire meeting. But that took a lot of prep. That took a lot of working with him to build his self-awareness on, what are his interests, his needs, his preferences. It took a lot on even IEP awareness, teaching him about what is this process. It is a litigious process. It is something that teachers get dinged for in compliance if it's not done right. So there was a lot of teaching about what is an IEP, how does that, where are your rights and responsibilities within the IEP. There was also a lot of teaching about those soft skills that go along with the communication skills, the presentation skills, the stopping and listening skills that is needed to really, be engaged in that level in the IEP. But that investment in it made that meeting for that student and made that year for that student a lot more positive and brought mom back into re-engaging with the school. And it wasn't something that needed to have a lot of extra time spent, in when we were learning about our presentation skills in English. That's when we had started talking about those communication skills that were needed. When we're learning in history about civil rights and embedding in disability rights in there so that we can embed in that conversation about IEPs and rights and responsibilities and different legislation that protect us, and what is our responsibility in ensuring that legislation is protecting us. So embedding in that content alongside the general education curriculum.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. Jess.
It really, like Chelsea said, it does take a lot of prep work. It takes a lot of investment and intentional investment, because it should not only happen in the context of when special education is happening. It should be embedded throughout the lessons. Also, not secluding or isolating. Part of this process is teaching others how to work with our diverse members of our community, where everyone has different backgrounds and backpacks filled with things that we may not see, may not know. So it part of that is also an empathy building. Like how do we increase our empathy and understanding of our peers, our friends, the people that we work with, and understanding each other. So a lot of that does take time and effort to invest in that and getting to know and just being super intentional, in building that, and building up someone's self-determination and building up a student's ability to identify, like, these are the things that I need to be able to go forward. Like, that's a lot of introspective ability to look in yourself and reflect. And how do you teach that? By practice. And how do you teach others? By showing them. So this is something that goes beyond just like our diverse learners. It's also teaching our gen ed population how to be supportive community members as well.
Jess, what I hear you talking about is this false dichotomy between special ed placements or contexts and gen ed contexts. And earlier, y'all were talking about like most of the students with special ed designations are in gen ed classrooms for a large part of the day. And so the question here asks, like, how do you feel about having special ed students in a circle with those in the general ed setting? And how do you address administrators who kind of want them to stay separate? Like, how do we have that conversation about the need to more fully integrate our students with special needs into our gen ed spaces, and not just integrate in a false kind of way, but really inclusive spaces? Yeah.
Again, it goes back to that assessing the need. So it does require a level of planning and preparing. But I'm taking it back to what I stated earlier. It's also teaching everyone else how to be part of a circle. you know, I worked with middle schoolers for 7 years, and those little people are very interesting in how they, you know, express themselves. There's no filter there. So teaching students to be respectful of one another, building on that piece of empathy, like how do you teach students to be empathetic and supportive of each other? I am not for separate. I am all for you belong here. You deserve to be here. We will do whatever it is that you need to be part of this process. The adults, if the student with needs has a para or an adult that supports them, that person, I would invite them in as well. Like, you are a support system for this student. Let's bring you in. Let's make you a part of this. But also uh, teach, have peer-to-peer support. Identify students that are able to help our students who may not be able to fully communicate or fully get their thought across. It takes, that's part of that intentional preparation. It really is an intentional process.
Thank you, Jess.
And I think that the piece about addressing that with the school staff, you know, that's like, hey, I'm not ready to have a student with a disability in my class. Like, that's a real fear that a lot of general educators have. That's where the power of your staff circles come in, using that staff circle to build disability awareness, to uncover what are those fears, and then how can we collaboratively work together to mitigate some of those fears. If we're not doing that as a staff, how can we expect to do that within the classroom with our students? And then when we are doing it with our students, starting off small, you know, starting off with our circle about what are our strengths, what are the things that we're good with, and then teaching to start to be like, okay, you know, some of you might have communication strengths in X, Y, and Z area. Let's start to embed those in our next circle that we're going to talk about our interests. So we're going to use that. And now we're going to start to talk about our interests and our preferences. Then let's use that to start to talk about what our needs are and to recognize that we all have different needs. Almost incrementally, slowly building disability awareness through your circle processes. So that when you do come to a time that maybe you need to use a circle to respond to bullying that might have happened, you've already built up the tools and the knowledge from the beginning of the year, starting off small, that you have more in your toolbox to respond to that kind of behavior.
Chelsea, what I hear you saying right there, and I've heard both of you say this throughout the webinar, that it takes time. Like, it takes time on the front end to plan the circle. It takes time to buy in, to get people invested. Linda's got this question here that I think is a really important question. Like, how long does it take to onboard people, to get them interested, to get them? And what you said a minute ago, I think speaks to that. Like, it's not just like, do they buy in, but can they overcome their own fear of trying something that's new and difficult? So can you talk a little bit about the process of bringing people on board to facilitate circles, to be a part of circles, to really want to do the work that we're talking about here?
I also feel like that time question always gets me, because it's ongoing. It's not like there's going to be a magical bam, we're a restorative justice school and we're good. You know, the reason why circle, you know, restorative justice is kind of represented by, it's continually ongoing. It's a cycle. We're always learning. There's going to be breaks in the circle. There's going to be time where new staff come in, where a staff member who might have been on board experiences something that changes their mind. But if we, as you know, practitioners, we're investing in that mindset, and we're saying, hey, we're going to continue to invest. We're going to agree to continue and invest. And then when we're finding spaces where the buy-in is starting to get low, then we need to go back, strip down, and we need to refresh. There's going to be many times, maybe 6 or 7 times throughout the year, where you feel like, oh, we got to pause and refresh. When we say the term embrace the process, is that circle is never going to end, but it's an ongoing tool to use to continually sustain change. Change is not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen in small increments. It's never going to be a quick and easy answer where oh, it's going to take the first 6 weeks of school and all of a sudden you'll assess, you'll know everybody, you're good. There's going to be consistent setbacks. There's going to be times where you're going to need to stop and refresh and go back to the beginning. So I always hate that question because there's like a, it's ongoing. It's like, it's when you have decided like, hey, I'm going to I'm investing in relationships. I'm investing in my community here. I'm going to recognize that I'm going to fail in this community, but we're going to repair those failures. We're going to move past those failures. We're going to, acknowledge that there's a lot of fear around, acknowledge that there's going to be feelings that are going to come up about those failures. And it's okay. It's also okay to go through phases of really blue times where we're all not on the same page. Like, that's okay. That doesn't mean that phase is going to last forever. It means we need to stop, refresh, come back, and kind of dive in and keep going. And Jess, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Yeah, it takes time. I helped open a new school where our foundation was based on restorative justice. And just this week, I went back to support them with some work that we're doing with them in partnership. And we had to hit the refresh because, it just called for a moment to stop and address what's happening. There wasn't, there's a dynamic that's happening that we need to go back to, even though the school has now been ongoing for 5 years. The time question, it has to be built in. It is a tool that we use consistently. It is something that we just go back to bring ourselves back, so we can go forward, or in this cycle, get to a better level within our cycle. But it takes time. And I'm just very big on practice what you preach. That practice, if it is how you're opening up your meetings, if it's, you can have a quick little check-in community builder for your meetings. You can have, just pause and we need to refresh because something is not working out for us. But it's ongoing. That's all we can say. It is an ongoing process. Be open to it and just be open.
Well, in many restorative justice texts, there's this whole notion of the compass versus the roadmap, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's what you're talking about. Like, here's the compass, and we're headed that way. And the incremental steps that we take as we move that direction all get us closer to that place. And it doesn't mean that we don't have specific practices, but it does mean that we have a direction. And it may take sometimes circling back around to come back to something that we maybe missed along the way, in order to reestablish that set of ethos, that value, the mindset that you talked about at the beginning of the webinar. Also, there's one question here talking about teachers facilitating versus principals facilitating. Can we unpack that a little bit, just when we think about circles and facilitation?
I definitely want to drive the idea that it's not always the leader that leads the circle. And again, keeping in mind the participants in the circle and what a harm we are addressing. So it can be a teacher, it can be the principal, but it doesn't always have to be the principal. So it's building up your team capacity to be able to lead different types of circles. Can call on different types of roles, staffs with different roles within the school. But that is something that is part of the practice. Like, as a school that adopts restorative justice, we know that anyone can hold a circle, anyone can step in, facilitate, we can support a facilitator. It can be a co-facilitation, but it's not always the person in the leading role that leads.
Well, and I also want to just name, like, sometimes power plays in, and we need to pay attention to that. Like, there are times when a student facilitating actually creates more of an equitable circle than a teacher or an administrator facilitating that circle, because of the power dynamics that can be at play in those places.
Yeah.
This question follows up with, do you ever bring in outside practitioners to support the conference facilitation?
Oh, yes.
Rather than someone in the school?
And our whole school model really works on how do we build the capacity within the school. So we may come in and kind of assess the school, do a lot of different walkthroughs to see where the areas of need are. There may be times where an outside practitioner will model a circle, but with the purpose of, hey, we're teaching this to help build the capacity within the school to being able to sustain these practices in the long term. So it's kind of a yes and question where, you know, with the expectation that, hey, we're doing this to model to be able to build on. Again, when it comes to a power dynamic where there is a space where more harm will be done if somebody within the school does it, then that might be a good time to come up with a neutral outsider. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to end my sentence in Bad habit.
Okay. I'm going to start one with so there you go. I'm teaching a class right now called Meeting the Needs of Diverse Learners, and it's for general ed teachers who will be working with students in their classrooms who have disability labels. And so I'm wondering, like, a lot of our conversation has been specifically about special ed and special ed teachers. Can we talk a little bit about not just how our understanding of special ed influences our understanding of RJ and the modifications we make to circles, et cetera. But can we talk just a little bit about how our understanding of restorative justice can help us understand inclusive classrooms and the language we use around disability and some of those justice issues related to special education?
I've done it in my small little pull-out group, and part of that is lived experience teaches better than like verbatim from a book. So first of all, checking in before with the student, like, are you comfortable talking about this? Are you okay? Ensuring, this is a safe space. Then opening up, setting up that space for students to share their experiences. This is what it feels like for me when I XYZ. This is what it feels like when I'm not able, or when I don't feel welcomed in a space. Like, setting up the conversation, or the facilitation of that circle where students it's going to be a vulnerable space where they're able to share their experience, because we best learn from each other when we understand where people come from. So help me understand. I have a former student who is now a colleague of mine. She is a wheelchair user, and part of addressing some of the language that we use, I'm sure some of us have been guilty of this, but saying someone who is a wheelchair user, calling them a wheelchair bound person, that's not correct. So I learned that. I was corrected from someone who has this lived experience that said, no, I'm not bound to this chair. I am a user of this chair. And that in itself teaches. It's a moment to teach, and it's a moment to learn from each other. And circles are a good space to also open up those types of conversations, like what is appropriate. In our presentation, when Chelsea was listing up the different titles and said, formerly known as mental retardation, to this day that word still bothers me. My sister, and in her was born with a disability, and I can look back at her papers and see that mental retardation was a label and title that stayed in her permanent records. So teaching someone, like, those words aren't appropriate. Yes, we once used to use them, but that is not appropriate now, and this is why. Creating those spaces for those conversations are extremely needed and beneficial and helpful, because that is the best way to learn, is how someone receives that and why we should not, or why we should. I truly enjoyed having those spaces with my students to be able to just hear from them. What does it feel like when you hear, especially sitting in those IEP meetings, when a student for the first time hears that their classification is emotional disturbance? That's a heavy title.
Right.
That is a very heavy title. So helping someone understand what that means, or coming up with a better way that, you know, expresses what their challenges are, but does not diminish who they are. Because some of those words can definitely be, they can be soul breaking.
So I think when we're talking about language, like there's a lot of different approaches to language. There's a lot of different models when we start thinking about disability. And one of the things we talk about in the class is, if we only talk about disability, what you're saying there, Jess, about your friend, like if we only talk about it through that deficit language, like we will miss opportunities to acknowledge the brilliance and the skills and the beautiful things that people with disabilities bring.
Exactly.
And seeing disability not as this monolithic thing that your whole identity is based on the fact that you're a wheelchair user, but rather, wow, you have a brilliant technological mind and are able to do this, that, or the other. And I think some models allow us to do that better than others. And I know, Chelsea, you're working on your doctorate in disability studies. Is that still true?
Yeah.
Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about some of those different models of disability and how some align more appropriately with restorative justice than others?
Yeah. Special education, I think what makes it such a fearful place for most people is the lingo. We have so many technical terms, you know, SPED and psychology and kind of that medical piece make it a very scary place to be. But when I was starting to engage in restorative practices, it started to help me see how we can talk about special education in more of a general ed way. Really looking at, hey, this is neurodiversity. We are looking at the variability of human beings. Restorative justice is focused on community and including everybody in our community and acknowledging that variability. Whereas in the special education world, we use all these very technical terms that kind of make it feel like it's a separate thing. When it's in reality, it's not. It's just good pedagogy. It's just good teaching. It's just recognizing the variability of the individuals in the room and how to meet those diverse needs, and how to be creative and how to just accept as well, to accept as part of our identity, accept as part of our whole. So I think that, you know, looking at restorative justice and looking at in special education, we look at neurodiversity. We use that term to really explain that when we're looking at like a Nora curve, like a normal curve, we focus mostly on the individuals who kind of are most visible, the ones that we see the most, the ones that are kind of that dominant culture. But neurodiversity kind of challenge us to look at the ends, challenges us to look at, hey, human variability is much larger and more complex than disabled and not disabled. And so restorative justice, I think, helps create the language to talk about variability and creates the understanding that we're a community, and within that community, we are there's a lot of variability, and that's what we're accepting. And where the complex problem or the complex challenge that we are charged with is, how do we create a community that embraces that variability?
Yeah. Thanks. Our time is running short. It is, there's about 5 minutes left, and we've got some other things. So I'm wondering if we could answer this last question really briefly, but what about students who are nonverbal? And in circle processes, we often talk about talking circles. What does that look like for nonverbal students?
Yeah. Restorative practices because they are rooted in Indigenous culture that tends to be more oral. I would kind of challenge you to think of that term nonverbal and think of maybe non-traditional communication. Our students have a way of communicating, but it's different. So now we need to might think about what are all the different ways that we communicate? We communicate pictorially, we communicate with motion, we communicate with gesture, we communicate with feelings. So how do we encourage our students to express themselves in those different ways and read each other in those different ways? So my challenge to you to kind of answer that question would be, I'm challenging you to switch that term to more, okay, how do I embrace non-traditional ways of communication? The student is not necessarily non-communicative because they're not verbal. They have, different ways that their preferences are of communicating, that their body expresses what's going on inside and then how their body takes in. So how can we embrace that, and how can we offer options? One way could be, instead of having a question prompt, maybe having a picture to hand around the circle for our students to react to. Maybe using storyboarding, where students can move around little figurines of themselves, and kind of showing, maybe allowing students to gesture and teaching them how to read gestures, teaching students how to read emotions from each other. So my responsibility to kind of challenge that term nonverbal, to kind of thinking, okay, maybe they're ways is maybe they have non-dominant ways of communicating, and what are other ways of communicating that we can pull into the circle. I do think that is an important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about your modifications, is that circles in general tend to be very oral because they come from those indigenous traditions that are very oral. So when you're considering those modifications for our students who may communicate in a non-dominant way, how do you? And then some of your earlier circles may just be around, let's talk about different ways we communicate, or then we're going to be using those different ways that we communicate in our further circles that we're going to be using in the future.
Circles are not static. They can, although yes, we say that we come together, we sit, we talk, but they are not static. They, like Chelsea shared, they don't have to follow the traditional way of that we identify communication. You can truly, we implore that you get creative with it, to really just make your spaces inclusive. And so that's part of that assessment process of like, what is it that my participants need so they can be part of this community building, this community engagement, this process that brings many people together.
Years ago, we did a silent circle in my circle process class. It was arts-based. It was beautiful. There was a piece of paper. There were markers, string, scissors, all kinds of resources past the talking piece, and very non-verbally, very silently, we all participated in this arts-based project together. And it was really a beautiful moment of circles don't require us to use words. And it built community in a beautiful way. So I really appreciate that it's not static. It doesn't have to be the one thing that it often is. So thanks for that, y'all.
Thank you, Kathy. That's actually really nice. I like that. We should have a silent one here.
So could we ask the two of you just to kind of summarize your ideas, and then we'll call this closed. I appreciate so much your wisdom, your insights, your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My summary for this presentation truly is just embrace the process. Again, it is not easy, but it does take intentional preparation. The purpose of this to be inclusive and bring in all players, all personalities, to feel included and seen in this process. So how can you create that? How can you challenge yourself to push beyond traditional ways of, holding a circle? How can you tap into that creative process, to embrace that process and be patient with it? You may make some strides and may need to refresh to keep going. Like you said, I love that, bringing it back to the compass versus the roadmap. We're going in a certain direction. How we get there will change depending where the wind blows, let's say.
And I would say give yourself permission to invest in your community. As we say, a circle, it's continuous. It's, if you're investing in, you're staying there. So give yourself permission to invest in it, and knowing that investment has positives and it has pieces that may, feel like it's taking from you, like where you're investing time, you're investing space, you're investing energy. But that investment has the positive return of our more inclusive communities, our safer communities, our better outcomes for our students. And that is the overall long-term goal.
Chelsea, thank you so much. I appreciate your commitment to restorative justice as an ethos that doesn't always have easy and quick answers, but a way of being that guides our steps. And so thank you for bringing your wisdom and your insights. And I would love to just continue this conversation forever. I have many, many more questions and would love to hear some stories. So thank you for your time today. And I'm going to turn this back over to someone. Erin, thank you.
Yes. Wow, what a powerful and motivating conversation. Again, thank you so much, Jess and Chelsea, for sharing all your experiences, perspectives, and suggestions with us. And thank you to Kathy for guiding the conversation and adding your wisdom. I'm sure that we will all be sitting with our learnings from this for a long while. Before we sign off, I have an announcement about our upcoming webinar. You're invited to join us again on December 20th, another Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, discussing exploring restorative approaches to human resources management with guests Michelle Jackett and Matthew Hartman and host DeMointe Wesley. They will be discussing some common challenges that HR professionals face, how restorative justice speaks to those challenges, and how the organization Just Outcomes works with HR professionals to develop plans for implementing restorative approaches. We look forward to having you be a part of that conversation, viewers. You're also encouraged to check out our website for our archive of webinars from the last 11 years on a diverse range of topics, and to keep up to date with any events and resources of the Zare Institute. We also welcome your partnership in the work that we do and are very grateful for your continued support. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.